Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. Wildfires are raging across the Los Angeles area for the second day in a row, and officials are saying that the worst still may be to come. Joining us now is Dr. Chad Hanson. He is a wildfire scientist and a fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. He is also the author of Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Chad, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So you are a wildfire scientist. You are well versed in this subject. Can we just start from the 30,000-foot view? How precedented or unprecedented are these fires? The photos coming out of Los Angeles are horrific and heartrending. But where does this stand within the context of wildfire events in the United States?
Yeah, it is. It is really hard to see just some of the images and the impacts to the communities. And these are places I know well, growing up in Southern California. And so it's tough to see in terms of the whether it's precedented or unprecedented. I would say Santa Ana wind events are a relatively common thing in Southern California in the fall and even into early winter. What's different here and what's much more extreme is the fact that Santa Ana wind event is not only much more powerful, faster winds than we typically see, but it's also coming at a time when we've had a really dry fall and early winter so far, and that combination is very dangerous.
As you look at the winds, as you look at the fact that this is 3 fires and not just one, exactly how dangerous is it? And I guess I should also ask about the speed. These started yesterday and have caused tremendous amounts of damage in just 24 hours. How would you characterize the danger here?
The danger is very, very high, and it's not just because the fires are moving at a certain rate. What's most dangerous is that they're in close proximity to communities, to significant population centers. And so we've seen the fires moving right through communities adjacent to some of the areas where the fires started, like the Palisades fire, for example. And now we have over 1,000 structures that have been destroyed already. My guess is that number is going to go up significantly because there's so much fire activity and so much smoke and so much chaos, frankly, that it's difficult for people to get a full count. So that's the danger. It's that proximity of extreme fire weather and the fires being driven by that extreme weather in proximity to communities.
Now, officials have said the worst still may be to come, which is a terrifying thought when you look at the damage that has happened so far. From your perspective, how much worse could this get, and what does that look like?
Well, the biggest concern, the biggest danger is, of course, loss of human lives, and some people have been killed. At least 2 that I know of. Now, I will say, and this is, I think, important, is that first responders have really prioritized getting people and their animals, whenever possible, out safely. They have been working like crazy, tirelessly to do that, and that's been their overriding focus, and they've been doing amazing work in that regard. I think that those numbers would probably be much more grim if they weren't doing that. But that remains the danger because the winds are very, very high still, and we still have these dry conditions. And so as long as that continues, it's not possible for firefighters to stop these fires. And that's a critical point. These are weather and climate events, just like a hurricane. You can't stop them when they're driven by weather like this. What they can do is try to get people and their animals out safely, and then, to the extent possible, do some structure defense and try to save homes. And they've been doing that, and that's exactly the right thing to do.
It is not possible to stop these fires. So I was going to ask you what could contain the fire. So not human intervention. Is it that we need these winds to stop?
That's right. When the winds stop, when the temperature drops, when the relative humidity in the air goes up and it gets a little more moist in the air, the fires will slow and stop. And that's really what is happening. Now, it's not that firefighters can never put out fires. It happens all the time. But when firefighters are actually putting out fires, it's typically in mild fire weather. There's an ignition, whether it's a lightning strike or a human accidental ignition. So it's a tiny little thing. It might be 1/4 of an acre. It's barely moving because the fire weather is mild. It's not windy, it's not particularly dry, and it's very easy to put those out, and they do. But in these conditions, yeah, you can't stop a fire that's really moving once the wind is acting on it, and once it's moving, it will slow and stop when the weather changes. And so, this is why I say we need to shift our focus away from trying to stop fires out in wildlands, because that's where we've been focusing our effort, and instead making sure that we protect homes and lives in the communities, because we actually do have control over that.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. What are your recommendations for protecting homes and communities? What mitigation efforts can people reasonably take on?
Yeah, so it's 4 things, and they're fairly simple and straightforward, and they're highly effective. Number 1, home hardening. And basically what that means is making the home itself more fireproof, more fire resistant. Sometimes it's simple things like sweeping the dry leaves off the roof, putting on a rain gutter guard so that dry leaves and twigs don't accumulate in the rain gutters. And what happens is the embers are blown by the winds far in advance of the flames, sometimes a mile or 2. They'll land on the roof, they'll roll down into the rain gutter, ignite the dry leaves and pine needles and twigs, whatever, and cause the roof to catch on fire. The other big one is exterior vents, especially attic vents. A lot of the older houses have a coarse wire mesh vent. It's like a 1/4-inch mesh. The embers blow right through that. And in many cases, the majority of homes that burn in fires burn from that single cause. A couple $100 at any hardware store, buy a modern ember-proof vent with a fine wire mesh, 1/8 inch, 1/16 inch. It'll prevent that from happening. So that's the first one, home hardening. The second one is what we call defensible space pruning. And it's basically pruning vegetation within 100 feet of the home at most. The first 30 feet is the most important. Dry grasses, lower limbs, things like that. The most combustible material, getting that away from the house. And then the third one is evacuation planning and evacuation assistance. A lot of communities don't have evacuation plans, and so you see some really, really bad things happen when a fire occurs because there isn't a plan and they haven't prepared for it. And the last one, of course, is we need to shift our focus and resources away from vegetation management and vegetation removal, removing trees, shrubs, way out in wildlands, trying to based on the idea that will somehow stop a fire from reaching communities, because it's not working. The fires are weather and wind driven, and they're blowing right through those areas where forests have been thinned or shrubs have been removed, sometimes faster toward the towns. And instead, we shift our resources to focus directly on communities to support the home hardening, the defensible space pruning, and the evacuation assistance and planning. If we do that, we will save homes and lives on a tremendous scale.
So I just want to dig into what you just said there. There are deep pruning efforts, logging efforts, etc., that communities will undertake in an effort to prevent wildfires. But your assessment is these efforts are not working.
Well, so if they're done in the community itself, they're extremely effective. Inside the community and immediately adjacent, within 100 feet of homes, that works. But if it's and it's really not logging; it's just pruning vegetation and making the houses more fireproof and doing the evacuation planning, the evacuation assistance. But if what's happening right now is our federal wildfire policy is oriented towards subsidizing to the tune of billions of dollars per year, mostly logging projects out in remote forest lands, mostly on public lands. And the narrative there is that will somehow curb a fire, it'll stop a fire, make it burn slow or stop, and it won't ever burn miles farther and reach a community. 2 major problems with that is, number 1, most communities that are vulnerable to fires are nowhere near a forest. They're in grasslands or oak woodlands or chaparral, shrub habitat. And so it does them no good. But the second thing is the communities that are in the mountains, in the forests, those fires are being driven by winds even faster through the areas where logging has occurred. Typically because logging changes the microclimate. It reduces the forest canopy cover, it reduces the shade. And so you get hotter, drier, windier conditions. And so, we're focusing on the wrong things, and we could shift our focus directly to protect communities, most of which are really in kind of lower elevation areas, nowhere near the forested zones.
Now, your book has a title that includes the phrase wildfire myths. What do you think is the biggest myth about wildfires that you want to correct for our audience?
I think the biggest one is the idea that wildfire, in terms of community safety, that wildfires are a wildlands problem. It's not a wildlands problem, it's a community problem. It's a community issue. It has to at the towns, at the cities, at the edges, in the suburbs. That's where it really is effective. It's the only place it's effective. And so just to kind of put a fine point on that, what the research is showing is that beyond 100 feet from homes or businesses, nothing you do out in the wildlands has any additional effect or benefit affecting homes. It's all about the homes themselves and that pruning 100 feet at most of the homes. And then, of course, evacuation assistance, because the planning for evacuation is key. You want to make sure everyone gets out safely. That's priority number one. The homes, protecting them, that's priority two.
In your experience and in your view, have wildfires like this one, these really intense situations, are they becoming more common, and is the Palisades fire our new normal?
They are becoming more common. We have seen an increase in wildfire activity over the past 2 decades. Climate change is certainly a factor there. Another factor is that we have communities in places that we didn't have communities 20, 30, 40 years ago in some cases. And so when the wildfire occurs in that location, there's a potential community impact that didn't used to exist. And so those two factors are differences from what we had 20, 30 years ago. And so the stakes are higher now. And so all the more reason why we need to do two things. I think recognize that fire is natural out in the wildlands. These ecosystems are adapted to fire. You don't want too much, you don't want too little, but generally speaking, it's natural. It doesn't destroy the forest or the woodlands, but it can destroy communities and it can claim lives. And that's the one thing that we can really do something about if we focus our attention and resources there.
Chad Hanson, fire scientist, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.